February 24th, 2022, exactly 2 years ago to this day, Russian tanks, infantry, and air power violated Ukrainian territorial sovereignty and invaded their country in a four-pronged invasion that attempted to decapitate the leadership, take out Zelensky, and end the war in a lightning strike fast. As we now know, that's not exactly how things turned out. Russia made some pretty substantial strategic, operational, and tactical blunders, which resulted in them not succeeding. The Ukraine side launched some tremendous counterattacks and showed extraordinary levels of courage, capacity, and bravery to thwart that Russian invasion and to prevent their country from falling. Their leader, Vladimir Zelensky, stood up and did some tremendous things and showed terrific courage and mobilized his people, inspired them to resist and stand firm when he could have ran, when actually many Western countries actually offered him opportunity to escape, and he didn't take it. He stayed there and he fought and he rallied his people, and they responded. And so this is the result today, is that the war has now turned into something of a slugfest. It did not go quickly. Ukraine was then not able to turn things around to drive Russia out. And now at this 2-year anniversary, we are at an inflection point. Now, there's going to be lots of people out today talking about, what happened in these 2 years, and they're going to be pointing to this action or that action. But to really understand why we're in the shape that we're in today, to understand why the war started at all, and to understand where we can go from here, you got to broaden the lens out a little bit. Not look at the last 2 years, but look at the last 10 years. And that's what we're going to do on this show today. We've got a tremendous aid to help us do that. One of this generation's finest foreign policy theorist, John Mearsheimer, is going to join us today. Actually, earlier this week, we recorded an interview with him where we're going to break it into several parts here, where he's going to lay out in some detail some of the disasters of American foreign policy, some of the things that we didn't do. Then I'm going to add in some of the other connecting tissue between some of those things to show this very consistent and troubling pattern that so many points along this war, going all the way back to 2013, actually, the United States, if it had used wisdom in its foreign policy, could have prevented this war from ever starting. Many points we had a chance to prevent war. After the war started, we had many other opportunities to end the war in ways to minimize the damage and to lay a foundation for a possible a good future for Ukraine. To date, we have failed in every one of those opportunities. And I think some of you are going to be shocked when you see this in context of just how horrific American foreign policy has been and how damaging it has been to our friend Ukraine. And let me just say right off the top, there's, nobody's hands are clean in anything. Anytime you're talking about a war, there's two sides. There's never an easy solution. There may be some that are more right than others, but there are definitely things that you should and should not do, especially when you're talking about the lives of other people. And that's what we're going to illuminate for you today. So strap in, because here we go. So first of all, let me show you the first part of my interview with John Mearsheimer, where he's going to lay the foundation of what happened back in 2014.
Well, it's very important to understand that the origin of the present war goes back to the April 2008 decision by NATO to bring Ukraine into the alliance. But we were not only interested in bringing Ukraine into the alliance, we were interested in bringing Ukraine into the European Union, and we were interested in fostering a color revolution in Ukraine. This is the famous Orange Revolution. So in total, what we wanted to do was make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. It's very important to understand that. And what happens in 2013, which leads to the Maidan revolution or coup on 2014, actually doesn't have much to do with NATO. It has mainly to do with the European Union. And in the fall of 2013, the Ukrainians are flirting with the idea of forming a special economic relationship with the EU. And the Russians make it clear that this is unacceptable. They don't like the nature of the deal. And the Russians offer the Ukrainians a better deal. And the Ukrainians, under Viktor Yanukovych, who is a pro-Russian leader of Ukraine, the pro-Russian leader of Ukraine, under Yanukovych, they switch gears and they abandon their efforts to work out a deal with the EU, and Ukraine forms a closer economic relationship with Russia. This leads to protests, the famous Maidan protests. And eventually, by early February 2014, things are reaching the boiling point. And on February 14th, 2014, you effectively have a coup in Kyiv. And Yanukovych is overthrown, and he leaves Ukraine, and he goes to Russia. Now, to get to the heart of the matter.
Yes, hang on. Let's pause at that point there, because ordinarily the United States always stands for the will of the people. And we want the legally elected government to be able to stay in power. But now that the legally elected government has been overthrown, and we're trying to help the other side, right?
I think, Danny, your understanding of how the United States works is wrong. We interfere in the politics of countries all over the planet. We don't ordinarily stay out and respect the will of the people. That's not the way the United States.
That's what we say with our mouth, but not what our hands doing off camera.
Yes, no, we are deeply interested in fostering color revolutions around the world, to use the term that applies to both Ukraine and Georgia. And we were interested in fostering a color revolution in Ukraine. And what we wanted to do was get Yanukovych out and put in somebody who was pro-American, somebody who we could manipulate. And by the way, we're interested in doing the same thing at the time and now with regard to Russia. We'd like to, ease Putin out of office and effect a color revolution in Russia. This is just the way the United States operates. And Victoria Nuland was on the point of the spear, right? She was, over there, and she was involved, but she was part of a much larger project that was designed to, we use the words, foster democracy in Ukraine. And fostering democracy means putting in power someone who will dance to our tune.
So for those of you who are just joining us, what we have here is an interview I conducted with John a few days ago, and we're putting it, several pieces of it out today on the 2-year anniversary of the beginning of this current war here. And we're going back to look over the last 10 years of this conflict, and what are the things that the U.S. did at various points to either facilitate it or where they failed to stop it when they had the power to do so. Now, you heard him just at the end of that last clip there talking about Victoria Nuland. Now, I'm going to get to that in just a second, because for those who may not know, she played a very instrumental role at the beginning during the Maidan coup to make sure that the legally elected government did not stay in, that we supported those who rose up against that organization. Now, John used the word there a minute ago. He felt that it was actually a coup because it unseated the legally elected government. Now, you may also hear other people use that same term, one of which is Vladimir Putin. We're going to get to that in just a second. But I want to understand one thing here, first of all. As I said a minute ago, anytime you have a war, there's all these different players, and they all have their different vantage points. And, some are good, some are bad, some are just neutral, some are just are. And it's neither good nor bad. It's just, this is the role they play. When you're talking about Russia, there is this tendency in the United States, especially, to say, if you say anything besides Putin is another Hitler or he's wicked and evil, then you must be on his side. That's nonsense. That's an immature way to look at it, and it's flat out wrong. If you want to have any chance of having a good outcome when you're going up against an autocrat or a powerful wartime figure, you better listen to him and understand how he thinks, understand what motivates him, so that you can, let's just be honest, if you want to manipulate him in order to get an outcome beneficial to our side. That should be and used to be a non-negotiable baseline of doing diplomacy. You talk to everybody, even those you didn't like to, because if you're not talking, then you have no chance of getting anything good on your side. That's the mentality that I think that we should have again, and definitely the one I do have. So when you look at the situation that John was describing there in 2014, Oliver Stone did an interview with Vladimir Putin the following year in 2015 to get his view of how he viewed that very situation right here. Here's what he was saying back then.
Правий сектор не складе зброї. Правий сектор не зніме блокаду жодної з державних установ, поки не буде виконана найголовніша наша вимога – відставка Януковича.
Я напомню, что перед этим, 21 февраля 2014 года, приехали 3 министра иностранных дел европейских стран в Киев, приняли участие во встрече президента Януковича и оппозиции, как бы договорились о том, что будут проведены досрочные выборы, договорились о том, как будут строить отношения между оппозицией и президентом.
It was characterized in the U.S. press as if Yanukovych abandoned Kiev.
Да. Значит, это версия для того, чтобы оправдать поддержку госпереворота. Стоило ему только уехать во второй по величине город страны на внутриполитическое мероприятие, вооруженные люди захватили резиденцию президента.
So you have President Putin there saying that the legally elected government, which was friendly to his side, so he certainly liked to have them stay in power. He sees that when all of this stuff happened in the Maidan, and especially in the February 20th, where things really started turning violent, that there was a group of EU leaders that came to Kiev and they appeared to have everything solved. So the protesters were demanding a new government. So he actually agreed, the sitting president actually agreed to early elections. So you're now going to get a chance to vote somebody else in if you want to. So it appeared that the issue was solved, but the United States was working to make sure that wasn't the case. And Victoria Nuland, who was then the Assistant Secretary of State, was in Kiev and was actually, someone recorded secretly a phone call between her and the U.S. ambassador discussing ways to support the opposition against the elected president.
Here's them discussing strategies to work with the 3 main opposition figures.
I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. I just think Cleach going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
So Vladimir Putin now hears that our senior-most government officials are actively working behind the scenes to overthrow the government that he likes, the one that was legally adopted and elected in favor of someone who's going to go against Russia. So he sees that we're taking active role against the people that are on his side. Then he sees out in the open Nuland boldly and brashly actually bragging or mocking anyone for interviewing or interdicting that phone call, doesn't deny anything, and then goes out and does this.
I'm obviously not going to comment on private diplomatic conversations, other than to say it was pretty impressive tradecraft. The audio was extremely clear. Hello, how are you? Good to see you. We're here from America. Would you like some bread? Please take something.
Thank you for coming here. This was Nuland and Pyatt visiting Independence Square in Kiev in December, handing out food to protesters and police. This latest episode is embarrassing for the US and allows Russia to argue that the opposition is being manipulated by Washington, something that Barack Obama has always denied.
So you had the president of the United States saying, no, we're not doing anything. This is a natural thing that's going on. And then She's standing out in front of everyone, handing out food to the protesters against the legally elected government. You can't hide behind that. And then you see she mocks and laughs when even approached with the phone call, where she's caught red-handed doing precisely what the Russians were claiming that we were doing. And then you have the president just lying and saying, no, we weren't doing that. You see this really weird disconnect between what you can see and hear with your own eyes and ears and what's going on. Now, we laugh about it, and certainly she did, and many in the West did the same thing, because basically, I don't care what Russia thinks or says. Here's the problem. Things start percolating in Putin's eyes and his mind when he sees the U.S. taking actions to help their side of this situation. Remember that point there. Mearsheimer continues on.
Anyway, you got this, let's call it a revolution or a coup. I would call it a coup. You had this coup take place on February 22nd, 2014. And that was the start of the real trouble, right? Because the Russians viewed this as a great threat. You see, it's not NATO at this point. It's EU related. Very important to understand that. The war in 2022, the war that's now taking place, which starts February 24th, 2022, that is very much NATO related. What happens on the Maidan, right, that leads to the coup is mainly focused on Ukraine's relations with the EU. But you want to remember what I said to you, and it's very important to understand this. It's not just NATO expansion that the Russians fear. It's EU expansion, NATO expansion, and the color revolution. And furthermore, if you look at the EU and EU documents regarding EU expansion into Ukraine, very importantly, it has a military dimension to it. So at the time, the Russians said EU expansion into Ukraine is a stalking horse for NATO expansion, right? So anyway, the coup takes place on February 22nd, 2014. And the Russians subsequently, almost immediately thereafter, take Crimea. And then a civil war breaks out in the Donbass. And we're off to the races, right? That's where it all begins in terms of actual trouble, right? What happened on April 2008, right, just set up the framework for future trouble. But
so this is probably a foolish question to even ask, given what you just got through telling me, but what should the United States have done when all of these protests had started up, different than what we ended up doing?
Well, the problem is that we were supporting the protests. The Russians clearly understood this. And we were clearly interested in turning Ukraine into a pro-Western bulwark on Russia's border. And we had to completely abandon that enterprise if we wanted to avoid the trouble that subsequently took place in Ukraine. And this is where the Ukrainians lose Crimea and a civil war breaks out in Donbass. And if we had wanted to avoid the war that is now taking place in Ukraine. In other words, it's American meddling in Ukraine, right? It was a bridge too far. The Russians were opposed to NATO expansion in 1999 when the first tranche took place and Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic came in. They couldn't do anything about it, but those countries were not so close to the Russians that they couldn't live with that expansion. The same thing was true in 2004. The Russians were willing to accept that second big tranche of NATO expansion. But 2008, April 2008, the Bucharest summit, that's a bridge too far, because we say at the time, is April 2008, that both Georgia and Ukraine will come into NATO. And you want to remember, Danny, that in the case of Georgia, you got a war in August 2014. The Ukraine war, or the Ukraine conflict, doesn't break out until 2014, right? So that's 6 years later, 2008 to 2014. But the war in Georgia, which is directly related to what happened at Bucharest in April of 2008, right, is directly related to what happened in Georgia in August of 2008.
Yeah,
So
just
we
months later.
made a huge blunder at Bucharest.
So Putin has been watching this since 2008. He's been warning every year that he is considers it a red line and an existential threat for NATO to come right up to his border, especially and specifically in Ukraine. In 2008, he takes limited military action against Georgia to make sure that one stays out, which was part of the 2008 NATO declaration. And now then he sees in the 2014 Maidan affair, he sees the U.S. directly taking action to help their side. Then, as John talks about, a civil war breaks out between the pro-Russian East and the pro-Western part of the country that wanted a different leadership in there. And violence explodes, and the Ukrainian military then starts taking action against the rebels. And then you have a lot of conflict along the line of contact there. That's when the so-called little green men from Russia do, in fact, enter into the fame, because Putin now takes action, as you see here.
Извините, вы можете сказать, из какой базы вы, из какой страны? Вы можете ответить на какой-нибудь вопрос? Yeah, they don't want to say anything. They're not wearing any insignia, but it's pretty clear that they're Russian.
Yeah, there was no doubt about it. They truly were, even though Putin denied it left and right. It was plain as day that it was definitely the rebels didn't have tanks and artillery pieces, everything else. They only came from Russia. That's flat out. But it was transparently so. He was not going to allow the western part of that country, or the eastern part of that country, fall to the Ukrainian side, because they were Russian speakers, and they were linguistically Russian. They were culturally Russian. And he was mainly, even more than just protecting those people, he was tired of the West coming and joining, moving towards him, putting it at risk, his security as he sees it. And now then, it's not just the Russians, though, because the Eastern Ukrainians, and this is critical to understand here, especially when you hear terms like Zelensky wants to take all the territory back to the 1991 borders. That means that the people who rebelled against the Ukrainian leadership in Kiev and didn't want to be allied with the West are fighting tooth and nail. And you see that they have just as much passion against the Western Ukrainians as the Western Ukrainians do against them, as you see in this clip.
Находимся мы в Донецком аэропорту, вернее, там мы находимся, все, что от него осталось, это точнее сказать, если посмотреть на все, что осталось. Мы находимся сейчас напротив старого терминала, бывшего старого терминала. И ремонту он уже не подлежит. Даже никому не известна дальнейшая судьба аэропорта. Будут его делать или он останется музейным экспонатом. Ну а дальше посмотрим. Мы здесь, и это главное. Я думаю, что все будет хорошо.
So what you saw, all that wreckage there, was the Donetsk airport. That is basically, in that part of the front, still the front line to this day. The big battle in Avdiivka you heard that fell to the Russians the other day was basically just on the outskirts, almost within range of that very airport right now. That's how fiercely they've been fighting for that. Now then, here's one of their actual commanders who was since killed in action, but he lays out just how passionate they are about defending this. And bear in mind also, all of that damage you saw there, which was 1 year into the war, that was 2015, all that was caused by the Ukrainian army that was attacking into the east. Here's what their commander had to say.
Людям надо восстанавливаться. Денег нет. Страна молодая, заново все начинает. Вот Россия нам помогает, чем может. Нам все равно с кем воевать. Это наша земля, мы сделаем все, чтобы ее освободить. Люди воюют до конца, и
And what happened after that was that around in that same year that video there was making, the European Union and the both, I guess, some of the representatives of Russia and certainly those the rebels in the eastern part of Ukraine were working together to try to come up with some kind of a negotiated settlement. They settled on what's called the Minsk Accords. You've probably heard that term a lot. It recommended a bunch of things. The bottom line is it was supposed to end the war, end the conflict, return even nominally all the control over the whole area back to Kiev in exchange for some autonomy for the eastern part of the Ukraine, and a recognition of the Russian language that they had had, for centuries in that part, so that it would be protected. That was the basic gist of it. And Ukraine itself would have a neutral status. They would not be joining NATO. That was the gist of it. That's why Russia was actually okay with that, and the European Union allegedly, and so was Kiev, because they signed it. They were too. But as we found out later on, is that it turns out that, in fact, no, the Western Europeans didn't actually want that to end the war. They wanted it to buy time for the Ukrainian army to continue to build up and be trained by a lot of NATO countries so that they could get ready for war to try and retake the eastern part of that territory by force. That's out there in the news. That's not some conspiracy theory. The former German Chancellor Angela Merkel admitted it publicly, and that's a fact that's out there. So then things continued to foster or to get worse. Things were rumbling under the surface. There was this constant back and forth, this long line of contact you may have heard a lot about. So over the years from 2015 to late 2021, lots of artillery duels back and forth, skirmishes here and there, sniper fights, but there was no big movements anywhere. So it was just kind of smoldering in the background. Then late in 2021, Russia started building up combat power, substantial combat power, all the way around their part and into Belarus, around Ukraine, and started making some very provocative statements that they wanted this to get resolved, or they would use military technical means, was the phrase that was used by the Kremlin at the time. And people at that time that were talking about that, especially in the West, were saying, nah, he's not going to do that. He's just posturing. He's just, whatever. He's not going to actually do it. Well, in the months leading up to this war, starting about the fall of 2021, I was paying attention to what kind of combat power the Russians were building up around there. And it was evident to me that this was not just posturing. You can send a bunch of troops to a certain area and you can posture, and Russia had done that before. But this time they had all of the kinds of equipment that you need to actually launch an invasion. They had medical support. They had large reports of large amounts of blood that had been stored up. Logistics were sitting around there. They had artillery. They had air power, armor, mechanized infantry. All of those things were arrayed around there. And it started looking like, no, they mean it this time. They're coming in. Concurrent with that, you had the Western side, instead of doing anything to try to tamp this down or to reduce tensions, you had NATO, and especially Jens Stoltenberg, the General Secretary of the NATO, emphatically saying, no, we are not going to give in to this. Ukraine and Georgia are still coming in NATO. We admire that what happened in Bucharest in 2008. We reinforce that is going to happen. They will definitely come into Ukraine in the future. And that just seemed to light the fuse for Putin. You can disagree with him. You can say he shouldn't have done it. But this is the point I keep making of why you need to pay attention to what your enemy is saying, your adversary is saying. He made it very clear in words and then actions he was getting ready to invade and to attack Ukraine. And we ignore that to our peril. I mean, it's almost like we were taunting him to attack into Ukraine. Now, whether that really was the case or not, I don't know, but I do know that was the result. And let's see, I believe it was in January, so about a month before the war, I went on CNN, was asked about this growing situation, and I warned we are on the cusp of war. One of the main reasons we're in this situation today is not because of anything that's been happening in the last 4 or 5 years or even since 2014, but going back decades. Vladimir Putin has been unequivocal and consistent since at least 2008, saying that he reviews NATO expansion to Ukraine and to Georgia as a red line. And he's already acted on it one time in Georgia in 2008 with limited military power, and he acted on it in 2014 by seizing part of Ukraine territory, the Crimea. And afterwards, he expressly said that this was to keep NATO from taking Ukraine and coming right onto his border. Now, if we think he meant it then, now that he has somewhere around 120,000 combat forces arrayed around Ukraine ready to strike, naval forces mobilized, rocket forces mobilized, air force mobilized, this is the time where he has all the tactical cards. And we can't keep going with the foreign policy that we've been having, which is like, we don't care about reality. We just want you to do what we want. But that's not going to work anymore. And I think that we either have to change policies pretty quick, or this is going to have a bad outcome. And of course, we didn't change policies pretty quick. If anything, we doubled down. You're going to hear that phrase again. We doubled down on this bad policies and literally almost taunted Putin to come in. And we continue to make these brash statements that, nobody tells NATO who can come into us. Only we can tell anybody who can come in. And we decide that nobody outside is going to do it. Basically saying we're not even attempting to make any negotiated settlement. On the 17th of February, 1 week before the war started, I at least made one more attempt to breathe some sanity into the situation.
So we have to take these dispositions very seriously. And to your point earlier about, he's Putin saying one thing, but then he's doing another. We have to look at what he's doing. Forget about what he's saying. We have to look at the type of forces, their physical location, and the fact that they are ready for action. And I have been in that situation before. And once you get ready for action, it's hard to pull it back down, which is why we need to de-escalate the situation and just acknowledge reality and take NATO membership off the table for Ukraine.
Of course, we didn't do that. And then war, in fact, did come. 2 years ago to this day, on February 24th, 2022, Russia rolled across the border. Air forces started pounding targets. Their special forces started airdropping into the airport around Kiev. They came in 4 axes and initially made huge progress because the Ukrainian side, ironically, was not prepared. And it almost seems like they didn't believe that Russia would actually come in because they had not taken many precautions and certainly hadn't built many defenses. And Russia literally just drove across the border in many places with no resistance and made a lot of progress up to that point. Now, at that point, I think then Zelensky was going, oh, shoot, this is much more serious than I thought. Even though he stood up, and as I said earlier, he made a tremendous speech the night before the war started that rallied his people. They were so much stronger in the north than many people expected. They thwarted the Russian drives on all 4 of the axes eventually. But it was also pretty clear that, as I had been talking about during those whole series of articles I had written in the 6 months prior to war, the Russian war machine is just too great a power to be able to overcome when you don't have it on your side, because the Ukraine side didn't have an offensive capacity. They only had like 250,000 active troops at the time. So they had to mobilize everybody, which means you don't have any actual experience, even at conducting combat operations. And anyone can see, yeah, this is not going to go well for the Ukraine side long term. Even though they were fabulous at the beginning, stopping an invasion is one thing, but reversing it is a very different prospect. And you may recall that in the first few weeks of the war, that Zelensky was saying, you know what, maybe I actually will consider a negotiated settlement. Neutrality would be fine. We can still work with the West economically and even bilaterally, but I would be willing to consider neutrality. I would even consider talking about Crimea in 15 years from now, basically just getting it off the table so that we can get the war over. And there was a lot of hope that the war could come to a negotiated settlement and actually stop. I was very excited about this. And in late March, I went back on CNN again to say, hey, there's something here. We should pursue this diplomatically.
Russia had been emphatic about saying neutrality and no NATO in Ukraine for more than a decade and a half. And even in the last few months before this, again, they said the same thing. On February 13th, just less than 10 days before the war, the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK floated the idea that maybe we would just say there's no NATO. Immediately, Lavrov jumped on that and he said, yes, if we could talk that could probably prevent war. And then, of course, Zelensky came back 24 hours later and said that's not what he's going to do. And that is now nearly the same deal that they're being offered now. So I think that there's a good reason to say they could have stopped the war at that point from even happening. But now it did, and so it doesn't matter. What we need to do now is put so much more effort, I think, as a global community on negotiations to get the fighting stopped.
But as you know, we didn't. So there's another opportunity where American diplomacy had a chance to end the war right there by putting pressure on all sides and helping foster a negotiated settlement. Everything was on the table. The Ukrainian side had penciled an offer that they were willing to do the key things that Russia was. Russia had signaled that they were willing to do the key things that the Ukraine side wanted, and the basis of a negotiated settlement was evident. And then it was tabled and just destroyed just days later. And whether it was actually the UK Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, or who knows what, some other things, there's lots of theories out there. I don't know. But I do know for sure that it was completely scuttled. And then you had Zelensky barely a week or two later saying negotiations were dead. He's not going to do anything. And then Putin said, okay, fine, that's it. We're not even going to talk anymore. Now we're just going to solve this on the battlefield. And then it really kicked into a high gear there. Now, over the next about 8 or 9 months or so, we saw, the Russian side was exposed for just how weak their military was conventionally. They had spent more than a decade of preparation and reform, allegedly, and rebuilding their armed forces after the loss of the Soviet Union, and it looked good on paper. But when it actually got into combat, we saw that they were made terrible strategic, operational, and tactical errors, just mistake after mistake. And I remember there's one famous one where they were trying to cross one of the rivers in their eastern part of the country, and they had like 2 battalions that were just wiped out because their tactics were so poor that the Ukrainian side was able to find them and just blow the heck out of them and kill a large number of Russians just trying to cross a river. Something that's supposed to be a basic military maneuver, they botched it totally, and it really messed up their operations there. But then the Russians did, though, recover from that. And then they had a couple of signature successes. They captured the city of Mariupol on the coast there. They got Lysychansk, Severodonetsk. So they had a couple of pretty big successes in there, and they were moving towards Kherson. They had Kherson City earlier. That was their first big city that they captured earlier in the war. And now they're trying to move towards Mykolaiv and some other areas there. Now, in the months leading up to that, the Ukraine side started really signaling openly that they were going to launch a new counteroffensive into Kherson. And so everyone's always talking about this. The Washington Post, New York Times, everybody's speculating on what that's going to be and when it's going to start. When it finally did start, at first it was just a terrible disaster for the Ukraine side. They just had huge casualties and didn't make much progress because the Russians knew it was coming, so they were kind of prepared for it. Then the Ukraine side had its best signature success of the whole war that by every accounting was, I think, spectacular, because it included forming an offensive punch, doing it in a secret way so that the Russians, with all of their capacities, whether it's drones or satellites, were blind to. They didn't see it coming because everybody was so focused on Kherson down in the western part of the front that they didn't know that in the northern part, in the Kharkiv area, there was another force that was being formed. And then Russia only had this thin line of basically National Guard troops who are territorial defense forces who had almost no training or capability, because Russia thought everything was going to be in the Donbass or in Kherson. So they had only a thin line up there. Well, the Ukraine command recognized that weakness, that the Russian side didn't build any defensive systems in there at all. And so they had this surprise attack that all of a sudden they just were rolling through. The Russians ended up taking over about a month or so the entire northern part of their country back. We're talking like 5,000 or 6,000 square kilometers. It sounds really impressive. It wasn't that as big as it might sound, because Russia really wasn't garrisoning the place. It's not like they drove them out of all these cities that they were trying to defend. Russia just didn't have a plan. I mean, that was another one of their major mistakes, is that they didn't see it coming and they didn't have a plan if there was an attack. So they were driven all the way back to the Oskol River and then a little bit beyond that, where they finally solidified up, because what Putin did is he mobilized 300,000 people when he saw that, oh crap, I'm getting my butt handed to me, and moved back here. The other big victory that the Ukraine side has, now that Russia had to take reserves and throw them up to try to stop the bleeding in the north, is that now then they didn't have enough to hold Kherson City. So they could have held on to it and fought, but instead their command said, it's just not worth it. We're going to abandon the city. And at the time, it was this huge victory for Ukraine, because they wiped out, a whole pocket in the north, and then they got the city of Kherson City back without even a fight. And so everybody at that time in the fall of 2022 was starting to think, hey, we can win this war. We can drive out the Russians. Now, I'll tell you that at that point, it was very important. Everybody on the West was so jitty and so excited about what was happening. And now then they see that, man, the Russians are, a paper tiger. They're terrible. Their leaders are awful. Their equipment is dumb. Their tactics and their strategy is flawed. We can keep pushing these guys and get them out there. On a surface level, I can see where people would think that. But if you were taking a sober look and understood how national combat power is built, you can see that Russia is big enough to be able to endure that loss and still recover. The Ukraine side doesn't have the ability that the Russian side does, because what hadn't changed? Russia still had an advantage in the air, big advantage. They still had a huge advantage in air defense capability. They had an almost domination in the long-range fires, almost a complete domination. They still had more tanks, artillery pieces, and most of all, they had more men. They had more manpower, like 5 times more military-age manpower. So they could absorb this loss, and they did have huge losses during this period of time, owing to fierce Ukrainian fight and just dumb tactical decisions by their leaders. It was at this time that the next great opportunity to end the war came. And even though you've seen me take him to task a few times on this channel, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said something that I totally agree with. And to this day, I still give him a lot of credit for coming out and saying this openly while everybody else was so excited about thinking they're going to win the war. He apparently saw the same things I did, that the overall power imbalance of power was still heavily weighted in Russia's favor, and a win was not likely. He went out on television in public in November 2022 and said this.
The probability of Russia achieving its strategic objectives, of conquering Ukraine, of overrunning Ukraine, the probability of that happening is close to zero. I suppose theoretically it's possible, maybe, I guess, but I don't see it happening militarily. So I just don't see that happening. But they do currently occupy about 20% of that of Ukraine. The probability of a Ukrainian military victory, defined as kicking the Russians out of all of Ukraine, to include what they define or what they claim as Crimea, the probability of that happening anytime soon is not high militarily. Politically, there may be a political solution where politically the Russians withdraw. That's possible. You want to negotiate from a position of strength. Russia right now is on its back. The Russian military is suffering tremendously. The Russian military is really hurting bad. So you want to negotiate at a time when you're at your strength and your opponent is at weakness. And it's possible, maybe, that there'll be a political solution. All I'm saying is there's a possibility for it. That's all I'm saying.
So he recognized, you could tell that that's not the popular thing to say. Everybody else was saying, yes, Ukraine can go on. What he implied then, and what I have said all the way through, from before the war, during that time, and definitely now, Ukraine never had a chance to win, as defined as he did by kicking Russia out, which was defined by Zelensky. He has constantly, almost routinely said he wants to kick Russia all the way back to the 1991 borders. That's been their stated objective almost from the beginning. Folks, they never had that chance. That's why I think Milley went on at that time to say, look, this is your golden opportunity, because he was also right. Russia was at its weakest point. They had just mobilized 300,000 people, and that means guys who are not at all trained or ready. Many of them were just thrown into the conflict line like within weeks, a couple of weeks. We're talking literal days of being mobilized and thrown into try to stop the line against the Ukraine onslaught at that time. So they were on their heels for sure. That was the perfect time to negotiate an end. Had we done so at that time, Ukraine would still have a majority of the cities that they would have had all of them that they had at that time, to include Bakhmut. We'll talk about that in a second. Several others, Avdiivka, which just fell a week or two ago. They would have had all of that. They probably could have negotiated to at least have some sort of autonomy control over the Donbass area. That was at least on the table. No guarantees at that point, but Russia was definitely at a weak point, and Putin would have had motivation to go back to the same deal that he had on the table in March of 2022 at Istanbul. He said that many times since as well. But he had motivation to say, hey, let's get this done so we can at least take the territory we have now, definitely keep Crimea, and stop the bleeding. So there would have been a reason, if we'd have had a good diplomatic push, that we could have done that. But instead, that's not what happened. So yet again, we lost an opportunity diplomatically to end the war, to end the suffering of the Ukraine side, and to start the process towards healing and recovery. So you see this theme is continuing on, but the war didn't stop. It continued. And so then after 9 months, you saw Bakhmut finally fell. That was one of the bigger mistakes of the Ukrainian side. They had already, in Mariupol, in the first several months of the war, made a big mistake tactically. Their leaders did, in that they, instead of abandoning the city, they kept the forces fighting in there. They lost like 7,000 men after it was surrounded. They never had a chance to hold on to it. They wanted this heroic kind of figure, and all they did was sacrifice thousands of troops, and they lost the city anyway. Unlike what the Russians did, they abandoned their city and saved 40,000 troops. That's going to come to play here in a minute. But then they lost Bakhmut, the Ukraine side did. And they repeated the mistake of the Mariupol, in that they held it too long. In fact, Zelensky said, no, we are not going to give it up at all, even though his General Zaluzhny recommended withdrawing from the city once it became untenable, moving back to next levels of positions of defenses that were set up. Zelensky refused to do that and says, no, we're going to hang on to it. And they literally made Russia pry them out of every single building all the way to the end. Now, some said, oh, well, that just weakened the Russian military because they lost so many men in doing that. But you know what? That was actually the Prigozhin's group, the Wagner group. So that wasn't the Russian army per se. That was a specific group. So the Russian army, meanwhile, was rebuilding behind the line of contact, and they were training new troops, while the Prigozhin's group was taking all of the losses there. And as you may know, a great portion of those were prisoners that he had gotten out of jails in Russia, which Putin obviously cared nothing about. So that was a good trade for him, because the Ukraine side doubled their mistake by sending a lot of the reserves in to try and hold that against all military exigencies that they needed for their offensive that they were planning to do in the summer. So they lost literally tens of thousands of men that they needed for an offensive, and they lost the city anyway. Then comes the offensive. And again, just like before, I had written a series of articles in the months heading into that, and I said, this has no chance of success. I said, even if it ekes out some success, I speculated in one article, even if they got up to 50 kilometers of a penetration before running out of steam, it's not going to matter, because Russia can absorb that, and then they can roll it back over time. As it turned out, they didn't get anything. They just got a couple of, a few kilometers here and a few kilometers there, at the loss of tens of thousands, and by some estimates, hundreds of thousands of killed and wounded, and they failed along the entire line. That was the next moment that the Western diplomacy should have said, oh, damn, we better make a negotiated settlement now, because this was basically the one shot that they had, because we had spent months and months and months preparing the Ukraine side, giving them hundreds of military vehicles, thousands from the U.S. alone. We're talking tanks, armored personnel carriers, howitzers, air defense systems, long-range missiles in some cases, or medium-range missiles, and lots of armored vehicles, trucks, supply trucks, all kinds of things. 5,000 total military vehicles, along with millions of rounds of artillery, of regular bullets, interceptor missiles, all kinds of things like that. The Ukraine side didn't dent the line. And there should be militarily, if you take the emotion out of it, that should have signaled to you there will be no military victory. There is no path to a military victory for Ukraine. It was evident before the offensive, and it absolutely driven into the ground any pretense that otherwise could happen afterwards. It should have been plain. Unfortunately, it has not been plain. Instead, the war continued on. Now then, a year after Russia's mobilization, more than a year now, almost a year and a half, they're starting to see the fruits of their labor here. Now, a lot of those people that they mobilized back then and started training some out of contact, now then they're starting to come into the line of contact. So they just, again, took, after many months, they took the city of Avdiivka. Already, they're following that up all along the line in Kupiansk, down near the Dnipro River, several other places. They're pushing the Ukraine side back. Ukraine is on their back foot everywhere. They're trying to mobilize another 500,000, but I don't think they're going to be able to. They don't even have enough money to pay those number of troops. And of course, as you know, the U.S. Congress is not given the $60 billion, but you can understand why they and many in the European Union aren't so keen on sending more money, when everything that they have done in the first 18 months of the war, all the thousands of military equipment, did nothing. $200 billion at least were spent by the U.S. and the European Union at that point. A few more billion now is not going to make any difference with all the losses that they've had. It's self-evident. You don't have to be a military expert to understand the logic of what I'm saying here. But unfortunately, the logic doesn't seem to fit into the calculation here, and our military and our diplomatic leaders continue clinging to the fiction. And I don't know how anybody thinks it's going to go anything further. And to show you how the fiction continues to this day, last week at the Munich Security Conference, when I guess was the next best chance for American diplomacy to recognize reality, to recognize the truth, the hard, ugly truth on the ground, and make a change, you had the Vice President of the United States standing next to Zelensky saying this.
The President and I, President Biden and I, will continue to work to secure the resources and weapons that you need to succeed. We will work to make sure Russia pays damages to Ukraine. President Zelensky, as President Joe Biden and I have made clear, we will be with you for as long as it takes.
So forget about reality. Forget about everything that I've just told you that's self-evidently true. Forget about the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men who are dead, many hundreds of thousands more who have PTSD, have lost limbs. They're going to be maimed for the rest of their lives. Forget about all that. Forget about the fact that the Russian army is growing bigger by the month. They keep not mobilizing, they keep recruiting, meaning volunteers continue to come in by the tens of thousands per month. So the Russian army is getting bigger. Their industrial capacity is cranking out full speed. They're going to go even faster than that. By U.S. estimates, they'll be cranking out about 4.5 million artillery shells per year starting this year. We might get up to 1.3. You see, we'll never catch up to that. Russia's creating all kinds of drones, multiple classes of drones to include electronic warfare to try to knock down the Ukrainian ones. If the Ukrainians come back, they get the F-16s later this year. It's going to be a handful, folks. It ain't going to make any difference. Russia's air defense systems can knock those down like they can knock anything else down. It's not a magic weapon. It won't change the outcome of the war. If they get the long-range missiles, apparently the Biden administration is now, after 2 years, thinking about giving them some of the long-range ATACMS long-range missiles. That won't make a difference either. Ukraine has had long-range missiles from Britain and from Germany. That can give them long reach. They can hurt Russia here and there, but it won't change the outcome. It won't change the course of the war, because that's not how wars are fought. It's not individual weapons here. It's how everything works together. Everything is in Russia's favor now, and it's going to get stronger over time. And unfortunately, it's because of our unwillingness to deal with reality. Then you have the Ukrainian leader, Zelensky, who's equally dealing with unreality. He said this.
To continue our successful story on the Black Sea, and we will do it. I will not now go deeply to details, but they will get some surprises. I mean, Russians. Yeah, that's very important. So South is very important. To defend East, where they have more than 200,000 soldiers, also very important to defend. And of course, we will prepare new counteroffensive, new operation. And of course, it's not, I'm not speaking that we will just stay. Of course, it depends on a lot of things. Yeah, some John shouted that. So will Ukrainians survive without Congress support? Of course, but not all of us.
Сказати одним реченням. 2 роки тому ми вогнем зустрічали тут ворожий десант. 2 роки по тому ми зустрічаємо тут наших друзів, наших партнерів. Прем'єрка Італії Джорджа Мелоні, голова G7, прем'єр-міністр Канади Джастін Трюдо, Урсула фон дер Ляєн, президентка Єврокомісії, Олександр Де Крoo, прем'єр Бельгії, що головує у Європейській Раді. І це символічно і красномовно описує шлях, який ми пройшли за ці 2 роки. І різницю між 24 лютого тоді і зараз.
That was just hours ago. So you see, I mean, they're putting on this big made-for-TV moment. Folks, let's just look at that for what it is, just to be honest. That has nothing to do, anything that he said has nothing to do with reality on the ground. None of that stuff has anything to do with changing the dynamics on the ground where the war is fought and is being lost by the Ukraine side. The longer that we go with this fiction, I mean, you see, it's an illness. It's not just in America. All of the European leaders that you just saw in that clip there, they keep coming on with fiction as though that by having a video clip and a happy moment and a spinning things in a certain way that they want this outcome, that's going to make a difference on the battlefield. But look, off the battlefield, off that video that you just saw there, Russia is continuing to crank out more men, more aircraft, more tanks, more artillery pieces, more long-range rockets, and every day they push forward on the line, and they will have thousands and thousands of more men that Ukraine just cannot muster. To continue along this path is to increase the chances that instead of having a negotiated settlement where Ukraine, even now, even at this late date, could have a negotiated settlement that in terms that are not as good as what they could have had at Istanbul in 2022, not as good as what they could have had last November when they could have negotiated from a position of strength, or in November of 2022. They had all the chances in the world. They keep throwing them in the trash. And who pays for that? It's Ukraine. It's the Ukrainian armed forces. It's the Ukrainian cities. It's the Ukrainian future. Because you're trading in on the Ukrainian future for this myth that somehow Russia is just going to fall apart, even though they've done the exact opposite, especially over the last year and a half or so. And every indication that you can measure shows that we're going forward. There's another article in the Defense One yesterday, I think, the day before, where it talks about it's going to be 2026 before all of our artillery manufacturing is up to scale, which will then be only a portion of what Russia is doing. Furthermore, all these tanks, artillery pieces, air defense systems that we've given, they don't have long-term support. There was a very ominous statement in the U.S. media in Defense One where it talked about how these were the same deficiencies in the Afghan army that we had. We gave them lots of stuff, lots of equipment, but they didn't have the capacity to maintain it, to keep it running. So even what they have is going to start falling off the table, being incapable of operating in the battlefield. So the numbers, it's not just what the Russians can knock out, but it's what maintenance won't allow to get to the battlefield. Folks, you see in every direction, our diplomacy over a decade of time has been abysmal failure, and we're just continuing to double down on the things that have failed. We're going to do more of them today. We're going to cling to made-for-TV moments like the one you just saw. And I'm sure that you'll probably see some comments from the White House along the same regards later today, or other senior officials. You can watch your news. I'm sure there's going to be some out there talking about how, no, this time we're going to turn things around, but we're not going to. And I leave you in the last portion here. I thought the last part of my interview with John Mearsheimer really drove this point home that is kind of discouraging to look at, but folks, it's the truth. Here's how he ended the conversation. So if I can sum up there, so the patient zero, if you will, on February of 2014 is what started us to the death and destruction that we're currently experiencing right now. And if we had simply not meddled and allowed the events to take care of themselves, Ukraine would still have Crimea. They may not have had a split in an actual civil war. I mean, I guess that's up for debate. But then this war would not have started. So, I mean, that's how dramatic our influence and our actions have caused things to spiral out of control in Ukraine. Did I get that right?
Let me just elaborate a bit on that. It's very important to understand in Ukraine's declaration of sovereignty in 1990 and in the Ukrainian constitution, right, neutrality was baked in. The Ukrainians were committed to neutrality. They only abandoned neutrality in December 2014. It's very important to understand that. If we had just kept our hands out of the pie and let Ukraine remain a neutral state, I believe Ukraine would be intact today, to include not just controlling those 4 oblasts that the Russians have annexed, but they would also control Crimea. There would have been no crisis in 2014, in February 2014. And furthermore, there would have been no war in February of 2022. So we are principally responsible for creating this disaster because we, the United States of America, were deeply committed to forcing and I think forcing is the right word, maybe pushing is the right word, Ukraine to abandon its neutrality and become a pro-Western bulwark on Russia's border. And of course, the Russians made it very clear as early as April 2008. You want to remember, Vladimir Putin was at the Bucharest conference. He made it clear at the time, and the Russians across the board made it clear at the time, that this was an existential threat to Russia. Ukraine in NATO, Ukraine becoming a Western bulwark on Russia's border was an existential threat. They made that manifestly clear. What did we do in response? We doubled down, and we have doubled down at every turn.
We have doubled down at every turn. It's hard to put it any clearer than that. Folks, what you've just seen over the last hour is a survey of how we got into this problem and why we are at the place we're at, and why, without major changes in the way our government handles the situation has much greater possibility for Ukraine to militarily lose the war and lose any ability to have a good negotiated settlement than there is for Ukraine to somehow magically find a new offensive capacity and win in the 24 or 25. It's just complete nonsense. And we have shown you very clearly all the places that our diplomacy could have recognized reality and changed the outcome to benefit our country, to benefit Ukraine. All those things were on the table. And even at this late date, they're still on the table if anyone will finally be willing to do the right thing that's going to have a good outcome. See, here's the thing. Just use self-interest. Even if you don't have any morals, even if you don't want to say, I don't want the Ukraine people to keep paying the price for our foolish policies here, it's in our interest to get this thing over with as quickly as possible, to end the threat of Russia getting even stronger militarily. They were weaker earlier in this war, and we would have had some success in that goal, which Secretary Lloyd Austin had said. That was one of our objectives. That was achieved earlier in the war. But because we've allowed it to go on, now Russia has reversed it, and now they're starting to get stronger. You let this keep going, they're going to get stronger still. We don't want that outcome. That's not in our benefit. It's definitely not in Ukraine's benefit. It is time to bring sanity and reality into the negotiated settlement and in the war in that way. Thank you so much for spending your Saturday with us. We're very grateful. I saw a number of you made some contributions to our channel. We are extremely grateful for that. Thank you very much. We recognize every one of those as being important, because we know you can go many other places, and yet you're spending your time with us. And we're going to continue to bring you great guests like John Mearsheimer and several others. And we're going to continue to give you these kinds of analysis that you just don't get anywhere else, because we don't care what's popular. We're unintimidated and uncompromised no matter what anybody else is thinking out there. We're going to give you the truth that you need to make sense of the world around you. Now, join us next week. We had the promo up there. We got a number of great shows that are coming back up. We're going to continue to do so. We actually might have a really big guest next week that we're trying to work some negotiated details out there with scheduling. I hope to have that for you soon. You're not going to want to miss that one because that's going to be something very special. Thank you very much for joining. Please like and subscribe and share this to your friends. I want as many people to be able to see the truth as possible so that you can see this doesn't have to end badly. It can end in a good situation, or at least avoid the worst outcomes. That's still not out of the question at this point. Thank you, and we'll see you next week on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.